Thanks so much, Jill, and thanks everybody for attending today. I hope you find the information really useful. Today, what we're going to talk about for this webinar is using the NIST Cybersecurity Framework to make smart decisions for your business. The reason we chose this, and just to give you a brief overview, is, we'll get into this in the introduction a little bit, which is, most small businesses do not specialize in technology risk planning. So if you think about a medical office or an accounting firm or perhaps architecture firm or whatever, I mean, they specialize in a trade or an expertise. And we're entering a world where there's going to be just more technology and the industry is just constantly changing. So as industries really embrace tech, they use servers locally or in the cloud. They have multiple devices that they connect to, that all of the work they do is done digitally. Now they're having to be risk stewards. And so this whole thing complicates the decision-making process, in particular as it comes to risk management. And people need to plan without being experts. So all of a sudden, these people who are really good at what they do in a specific expertise or specific framework now need to be cybersecurity experts or risk management experts, and they don't really have the background and expertise to do so. So I feel like NIST and this general framework with the 5 key areas, which we're going to talk about today, really offer people who are not experts a way to think about technology risk planning so they can make good decisions. So the agenda today is we're going to talk a little bit about NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, as part of the Commerce Department of the United States. They offer many free resources to the public regarding cybersecurity planning. It really is a great tool. I can just, speaking for myself, I've been working with the tools that NIST has offered and the frameworks that NIST has offered for a number of years, and it's really helped me and the clients that I work with come up with good ways of coming up with technology plans. So we're going to look at the 5 key areas or functions of the framework. So essentially, these are general areas, then they're themes really, as opposed to specific technology tools, right? So it's not like one of these areas of functions is backup. It's more about, for example, recover is an area where we're talking about ideas and concepts, so that when you're going around and making decisions, you don't necessarily need to think of the specific tools. We'll help you with that stuff. You want to think of these themes. And so as we go through this, my challenge to the audience is to think about whether these themes have been sufficiently considered as a part of a risk management plan. So when we look at these things, think about how it might apply to you and where these holes might be. And we're going to challenge you again at the end here. So the first area that we're going to talk about for the NIST framework, and there are 5 key areas, is the identify area. And I'm going to take the words directly from NIST and then give you some ideas about how to interpret them. So when you talk about identify, what we're talking about is an organizational understanding or a business context. So we have to know what assets we need to protect. So it really is the first start to any kind of risk management plan. If we don't know what we have to protect, how can we come up with an adequate risk management plan, or a risk management plan that applies to the right areas? One area is asset management, and so you can look at assets in multiple ways. And sometimes you might hear me talk about physical assets or technology assets, and these would be things like the PCs, servers, cloud hosting providers you use, the laptops, desktops, networking equipment, so on and so forth. But also you need to think about assets when it comes to actual information, right? So all of the technology and tools are one thing, but the real asset that most organizations care about is the data that they use. You can go to Amazon and purchase a new laptop fairly easily. You can't replace the data that is on that laptop so easily. So what assets do we care about, both physically and digitally, as part of our risk management plan, and what is the impact? So what's the organizational support and infrastructure? So what kind of team do we have? Where do those people work? How do they work? Where do they connect from? What are the legal and regulatory requirements? So essentially, if we are looking at what kind of assets we control, where those assets are located, what kind of data we're dealing with, who we're liable to, whether, this is something that's changing right now. Obviously, we have things like GDPR in the European Union, the California law that was just put into place regarding data privacy. I can speak to personally to the fact that on these Maryland Chamber of Commerce calls that I'm on, we are talking more about data privacy laws that are coming up in Maryland, so where we're located. So you're going to see more and more of these laws and regulations start to impact the data you touch. And another goal here is to determine the risks to the organizations and response activities and plans, as well as the risk tolerance identification. So when we're looking at identify, what we want to say is based on what kind of assets we have, what kind of legal and regulatory requirements, what risks are out there, and what is our tolerance for these risks. So let's say for the sake of argument that we carry personal data for our clients. How long can we be without that data before it makes an impact to us legally or as a business? We have to know what our risk tolerance is up front, because based on that risk tolerance, how much we're willing to bend, how long to recover, what kind of loss we can sustain, and how much it costs our organization, we have to use those details to identify what kind of products and services and plans and processes we put in place. Have you really thought about risk tolerance identification? A lot of times, no. A lot of times when we come into a client and we start talking about these things, they think of it purely in broad themes, like we can't be down, or things need to be up, or we can't be hacked. But the reality isn't so much whether we can be down. Downtime is something we may not be able to avoid. The real question is, what is our risk tolerance? How long can we be down before things really start to stretch and bend? Protect is the next area of the NIST framework. This is area number 2. And when you think about protect, it's safeguards to ensure delivery of critical infrastructure services. In other words, tools to protect our assets. What systems and processes do we have in place that are going to make it so that we have an active defense? And everybody should have at least some of these things. These are the things that oftentimes smaller businesses will have, maybe not in an adequate amount, but they'll have some things in place, and they're the easiest to relate to. So one area is identity management and access control. So when we're talking about identity management, what we're really talking about is when somebody goes to a portal and they say, hey, I'm Ben Schmerler, and I would like to log into ConnectWise. ConnectWise is one of the systems we use to report tickets and things like that. How do we know that it's Ben and not somebody pretending to be Ben? And the answer to that is we use tools like multi-factor authentication, usernames and password management, in order to ensure that when I'm logging in, it is that I'm the person seeing this data and not somebody else. As well as access control. So access control is a different concept. So Ben Schmerler logs in to ConnectWise. Well, Ben Schmerler needs to see the information that Ben Schmerler has the right to see, not that maybe Joe Rose has the right to see, which might be information relevant to her, maybe personnel information or private information. We have to have strong access control so that the people who have access to the assets are the people who are who they say they are and have the right level of access. Another reason that this is so important is that we have to limit our risk here. If people have access to things that they shouldn't have access to, or rights that they shouldn't have, for example, installing applications on a server, if somebody exploits that user's account to rights that they maybe don't deserve, that means the damage as a result of a hack could be worse. So we really have to control that. Another area of protection is security awareness training, things like what we're doing right now. And if you participate in some of our phishing and security awareness training and testing, every organization really needs to have an active, engaged team that has general awareness of the types of threats they're going to see every day, so that when these things happen, that they can protect themselves and also report on these things in a strong, proactive way. So we have to have good security awareness training as part of our protect measure. We also have things like data security protection. And when I talk about data security protection, we really have 3 core concepts of protecting our data. One is confidentiality. One is which is the idea that only the people who are entitled to see the data are able to see it. Things like in a medical environment, that the people who should have access to patient records are the doctor and the patient, and perhaps special administrative staff who should be able to see that record for billing purposes or something like that. Integrity is the concept of protecting the viability of that data. So the medical record for Ben Schmerler is Ben Schmerler's record, that the data is not corrupted somehow because of failure of a hard disk or something like that, or that the data was corrupted as a result of ransomware encrypting the data or something like that. We have to make sure that the data is available to us and it has integrity, that it hasn't been manipulated. There's also the concept just of availability. So getting back to the medical example, if I'm a medical doctor and Ben Schmerler walks into my office and he's getting surgery that day, I need to have his records available to me so that I can perform my task well. And so we have to have some kind of measure of availability and tools in place so the data is reasonably available. We can't ever guarantee 100% uptime, but we need to make sure that as an organization, we can provide the services to our clients that we need to, which means our data has to be available to us. There's also the concept of maintenance. So forget about all of these tools and multi-factor authentication and making sure the data is confidential, but what are we doing to maintain our system so there aren't holes on the system? If you are one of our Confidence Plus clients, you probably have patch management in place, and it's really important that we run these patches, because no matter what we do, if there are holes in the system because someone has identified that the vulnerability that was issued by Microsoft on January 14th that the NSA discovered, it doesn't really matter some of these other things we do. Some people could break into our system, exploit our weaknesses, install ransomware, have access to our data, so on and so forth. So we really need to make sure we have a good maintenance plan in place to make sure our systems are properly tuned. There's also the idea of resiliency of systems, that that a power outage just doesn't knock everything down for a day. That a hard drive, if in a server a hard drive fails, that we have other things to keep that server up, or if that a network card fails, that a backup network card is in place, or backup power supplies, or whatever, things that we don't just touch the server and the server fails. We have to have some kind of resiliency in place so that things don't fail just with a little bit of stress. Stress is going to happen on systems. That's just how things are. There are things that are going to test this. We need to make sure our systems are reasonably resilient. The next area we're going to talk about is detect. Is that what do we have in place to discover that cybersecurity events exist? You might not be surprised that it's often in this area where organizations have challenges effectively implementing controls, because detecting cybersecurity events can be really difficult. Oftentimes, people only know that an event has occurred once the damage starts coming in. So one idea is monitoring. So that is both of physical and network activity. So a very simple example is like most of you probably have alarms on your doors, that if somebody in the middle of the night decides to break in and break some glass or push open a door or something like that, break a lock, that things go off, that the alarms go off, and that the authorities are called. That's very important, right? There's no point in having cybersecurity if someone can just grab your technology, walk off, and read the data. But there's also the ideas of network monitoring. There's a couple things we use. One tool is a tool called AUVIC that we utilize, which helps detect network issues, right? So if a network is slow, we might be able to determine which port on a switch is going bad, which ultimately, in the end of the day, speaks to data availability and reliability. There's also things like managed detection and response, which speak to areas like somebody is actively trying to break into a system. What is in place to say, hey, we have an active attack going on, and create an aggressive response? While that may not be viable for every client due to investments or system design or things like that, these tools are often necessary to achieve the risk tolerance goals of certain organizations. And that's something that if you really are interested, it's worth having a very serious discussion to find out whether it works for you. Another part of detection, though, is maintaining these specific tools, right? Think about the target breach and how all of this data was taken in, and there was actually when all these credit cards, all this credit card data was stolen, the information was available to target to respond to this, but the tools and management of these tools were not well maintained, and so the breach went on longer than it needed to. We need to have good systems in place, not just to detect these events, but actually maintain and manage them. It's also important, again, to understand the impact of potential events. So somebody failing to log into a system repeatedly remotely who's a bad guy, that may have minimal impact. But somebody who is actually doing this 1,000 times an hour, that impact, if they get in, is catastrophic. So we need to understand what happens if somebody breaks into our systems. What do we have to detect that and stop them from creating further damage? As I mentioned before, it is often here where organizations have challenges effectively implementing controls. There are limited resources to detect stuff, limited network security engineers who can figure out what is going on with it. And so this may or may not be as achievable. The important part is that we understand what our posture is and have a good approach that reasonably addresses risk to the best of our abilities with a reasonable return on investment for risk management. The next area is respond. So what is our ability to respond? What kind of actions can we take regarding a detected incident? A really important part of this is having a planned process. So if something happens, and this could be as simple as a user finding that they believe that they have malware installed on their PC because of a weird pop-up, we need to have a planned process in place so that people know who they talk to, what their support is like, who's part of the incident response team, and who we report to. So we have to have a planned process in place before these things happen. People need to know who they report to when these things happen up front, not after the fact. We need to think about communications with stakeholders internally and externally. So this may vary depending on your business, but for us at DP Solutions, let's say for the sake of argument, we had a specific incident that we had to respond to. We need to think about what we communicate to our team. Hey, you know, we're experiencing a significant outage. We're under a ransomware attack. This is the way you have to work. These are our expectations about when things are going up. These are resources available to us to resolve this stuff, as well as communicating externally. Like we'd have to communicate to our clients and say, okay, we are the victims of a ransomware attack, God forbid. And as a result, this is how we're impacted and how you may be impacted, and here's ways we can respond to you. I hope that never occurs, that we have to do this, but it may not surprise you that we have exercises here where we talk about incident planning and incident recovery, and tabletop sessions where we have to respond to this stuff, because we can't take it for granted that these things won't happen. We have to be planning for it. We need to have an analysis to determine the impact of the incident. So once the actual attack happened, what actually occurred? What was the actual impact? Were we just down, or did we have a data breach? Do we have to report to certain individuals, so on and so forth? Another important part of responding is preventing expansion of the incident. There's a really big difference, you know, seconds, minutes, etc. Depending on how agile we respond, how quickly we respond, if we respond to the right people and report the right way, we don't meddle too much in things that we're not familiar with, that we allow the experts to do their work to stop these incidents. There's a significant return on preventing the expansion of an incident. You know, obviously in the news right now, there's a lot of talk about things like coronavirus. Well, it's really not dramatically different than stopping you know, the spread of a viral disease, right? When we discover that there's some kind of big outbreak, what is it that we can do to stop that outbreak from spreading? Really not all that different with ransomware. If we have ransomware or some kind of worm infecting a network, we need to do everything we can to stop the spread now before it creates serious damage to the organization. Again, not very much different than viral outbreak. We should also be applying lessons from the incident for future planning. So what happened here? And you know, this is a thing that happened. We were stuck with the consequences. We're dealing with it. Maybe we've recovered. But what could we do to prevent this in the future? Was this even preventable in the first place? If so, what could we have done better in our response methodology? Are there tools that we could have implemented that maybe have made the incident less eventful? And are those tools viable from a financial perspective? Is the juice worth the squeeze, so to speak? But we should be looking back and saying what occurred and how do we respond to it, and what could we have done to make that response better, if anything at all. If the answer is nothing, well, so be it. But often we should at least try and challenge ourselves to say, what is it that could have been out there? The last area of the NIST framework, the general areas, are recover. So restoring capabilities that were impaired. So a lot of people are probably familiar with this one. So having recovery planning process in place. And again, this applies not just to things like ransomware, but also fires and floods. So, what is it? The servers went down, the system has failed. What do we do to bring things back up? Are we using a backup system that maybe has limited capabilities until we fully bring up the full system? Are we recovering to a identical offsite location and nobody really even knows that we were down in the first place? I mean, those are achievable things if the system can be designed and invested in to do such. What kind of recovery planning do we have in place so that we can come back reasonably quickly, at least as well as our risk tolerance demands? After we have that incident, I mentioned on the previous slide that we have to do an analysis to see what could have been done better. Well, part of the recovery process is actually implementing the lessons learned. Hey, we were the victims of a phishing attack. We ended up allowing someone access to our system accidentally. We didn't intend to, but we think they may have gotten access to our email or whatever. And so now, as a result of that, we are going to adopt a training program so people can learn a little bit more about what a phishing attack might mean and what red flags to look out for and what social engineering is, and create more awareness so that maybe our culture is a little bit more refined to be agile enough to deal with these things. Communications. So again, another important area, which is, hey, we're in the middle of recovery. What is our team doing to recover? What should they know about the recovery? So on and so forth. It's very important that we be transparent about these things. And that communications may be internal and external. So as you might imagine, recover is very similar to respond, but the focus is really on getting things back to normal as compared to stopping an attack. So the response area is really focused on, hey, we're in the middle of attack. What are we doing to stop the attack? And recover is, okay, let's get back to normal. Let's get back to speed and healthy again, and get back to regular business or a more protected business more accurately. Before we wrap up the main content and get into the Q&A, it's important to bring up a few other thoughts that we had, because it's really important that we take something away from this and not take things too for granted just by going over 5 general areas. The first is, based on some of the things I discussed today, are there areas here that you feel are lacking? Are you sure that you have a reasonable approach to dealing with these 5 core areas? The answer may be no. And the truth is that a lot of organizations are struggling with this right now. We are in a very aggressive cybersecurity landscape. The phishing attacks and social engineering attacks are getting worse. I mean, I've been saying this for the last couple of years, but I want to stress that this stuff isn't getting better, it's getting more significant. As we leverage technology more, as we rely on this stuff more on our day-to-day, people are going to use this as a method of attack. You're seeing responses from governments right now. One great area is that the New York State is about to implement a law that would make potentially ransomware payments illegal. So we need to figure out how that impacts us. Another really important thing I should mention is that this is not a one-size-fits-all thing. This is not exclusive. I talked about a lot of things that people can do, controls and elements in place that can help reduce risk as part of the NIST general framework. But there are elements of good security practice that aren't necessarily in the framework. I didn't really talk about mobile devices today very much. I didn't talk that much about remote workforces. I didn't talk too much about third-party auditing. One thing that was not really mentioned in all of this is security assessments, vulnerability testing, things like that. That may be important to do. That's really not in this framework, as well as general good system design. So think about the idea of putting ourselves in a position to keep our risk low. What about when we're building a system for the first time, or we're redoing our systems? Let's say the company has changed, we're redoing everything from scratch, or we're starting a new company. The decisions we make about what tools and services and our organization as a company will impact our cybersecurity posture. So really, I recommend to people to make security planning a part of the design process up front. The NIST framework doesn't necessarily talk about that. But I think it's a good practice to help reduce risk and is very, very important. Some of these rules and areas are very difficult to apply to cloud assets. So think about, for example, people who host their systems, Office 365, they host their email with Microsoft. And then they think about things like resiliency. How resilient is the system? Well, that's a really tough thing to say, right? There is the resiliency of Microsoft, which is highly resilient. Generally, the things we do online with Microsoft are pretty much up. They have issues, right? There's no 100% uptime, but things are generally up. What is probably less reliable than Microsoft and their data centers is maybe your home internet connection, or your office internet connection, or the Wi-Fi, because the walls in your office don't let signal go through really well, or something like that. We have to think about, for example, with availability concepts, what is it? Where are the actual risks, right? We have to trust our cloud providers to give us a good contract that has good uptime, a good SLA, so on and so forth. But we have to think, well, what can we control, and what do we have that we could apply those 5 areas to? Good risk planning needs to consider other practical concerns like a fire. So I know we talk a lot on these webinars about cyber risks and hacks, social engineering, and things like that. There are plenty of risks and incidents that happen every day that have really nothing to do with the big stories you hear in the news, like ransomware attacks, data breaches, etc. Fires and floods happen. Sometimes there are robberies and things like that. People break into offices. Sometimes you have a rogue employee who has a vendetta against management for whatever reason and does something that we wouldn't like. Maybe they send a bad email, or they steal data, or something like that. We have to consider, as part of our risk profile, things that can happen outside of hacks. I know everybody wants to think of hacks, but risks come from all areas, and so we have to think about that stuff. That is it for the planned content. I thank everybody for joining us. We're going to do some Q&A. While I wait for Jill to have to get the questions, we were supposed to have a slide here. I guess I have the wrong version, about our topic for next month. Jill, would you like to speak real quick about what we're going to talk about next month, and I'll elaborate on it while we do questions?
Yes, certainly. So next month, March 25th, is the webinar. It's going to be on data collection and data management best practices.
Yeah, so thank you, Jill. And I'm sorry, I couldn't remember off the top of my head. One of the things we want to really talk about now is as these privacy laws come into place, there's going to be increased focus on being a responsible data holder, or data manager, if you will. Think about GDPR. A lot of the rules in GDPR from the EU are about the ability for people to have their data removed, or for them to ask, what data do you have on me? A lot of organizations start collecting data, and they don't think about the ramifications of collecting that data in advance. So they say, for example, hey, just to make this easier, we do renewals of our membership every year. We're going to collect people's credit cards so we can just run their cards every year. Well, now, because they've collected that data, now they are liable to PCI. And we need to think about this stuff before we start collecting the data. Let's think about the pothole we're gonna step in. So we're gonna talk about things like that next month, and I hope that's very useful to the audience. So with all that being said, Jill, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. So far, we have 2 that came in. First question is, doing risk management means you must always be looking for more information about threats and vulnerabilities. What do you consider to be the top 3 sources of information that my organization should have a persistent practice?
Wow, that's a complicated one. All right, so can you repeat the last part of the question?
What do you consider to be the top 3 sources of information that my organization should have a persistent practice? I guess, what do you consider the top source of information the organization should be using?
I hope I'm interpreting the question right. And if not, I encourage whoever's asking this to do a follow-up with me. You can email me, and we can chat in more detail. I use a number of resources to get information. And I would recommend, thank you, Jill put the question in chat for me. I use a lot of things personally. Oh, I see. So like, how do I educate myself? I think I'm grasping a little bit better. I'm sorry. One is just the news. And so I spend a ton of time, and Jill can talk about this because I'm always in her office annoying her, telling her, hey, Jill, I want to write a blog about this, or I want to write something about that. I read a lot of technology news, and then I sort of go down rabbit holes. So, for example, there was an incident just a few days ago. I don't know if anyone on the line has a Samsung smartphone, but in the middle of the night, everybody's Find My Phone on Samsung smartphones go off, and people become terrified. They're like, "Whoa, what happened? Why did my phone get a Find My Phone thing? Is someone hacking my phone?" Blah blah blah. Well, it turns out it was a bug from Samsung. There was no actual incident, and I used Google and Reddit and other places to start researching the issue, come up with what's going on. Another area is our clients ourselves. Honestly, where I start to get a lot of my information, and I have to apologize, a lot of this is going to be a little bit personal, so I hope it can apply somehow. But like when I deal with my clients, I'm often asking them about what threats they have, what are the challenges that they have as an organization. And recently there's been a focus, for example, on CMMC for federal contractors. So the people in the federal space who work with DoD and other organizations, I'm starting to see things about CMMC compliance and what levels they have to reach. And so this is all new frontier stuff. And what I do, I went to the government's websites, I started downloading their documents. Even before the full version 1 came out, I was reading the old versions, and I would just dig into it and read a lot. I network with people on LinkedIn, people who are in different cybersecurity disciplines. A lot of what I do is focused in governance, so creating good programs. I'm not a security engineer, but I feel like I can create a good platform for cybersecurity. So I start reaching out to assets and vendors as well. For the layperson, what would I recommend? I would recommend very much reading, you can even get from major newspapers, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, places like that. I like reading the technology section because they speak to big trends. There are good blogs to read. I utilize LinkedIn a lot of forums there. I utilize social media sometimes. So sometimes I read things on Reddit r/technology on Reddit because that gives a variety of different topics. Usually what I do is I'll start there when I'm trying to just see what's going on, and then I'll dig into specific issues more. Google is really a tremendous resource. I go down rabbit holes. I know this is kind of a rambling answer, but there are so many sources. And also I should point out just the group I brought up at the beginning, NIST, the NIST website, the SANS Institute, SANS Institute. They're great resources for frameworks that create, ideas for cybersecurity, and then for SANS, policy frameworks in terms of creating good internal policies. There are so many sources. So I would recommend to the questioner, if you have specific challenges, specific things you're looking to achieve, please don't hesitate to send me an email, and I'm happy to have more of a dialogue with you. I want to make sure I'm answering your question as best I can. It's a very tough one.
Okay, great. Yes, he did say you're answering it very well. So.
Oh, great.
Our next question. Yes. Okay, next question. Mobile phones that connect to the company network, should those phones have virus protection on them, such as Norton Mobile Security?
That's a good question. So, I think it depends on the OS. My understanding is that for Apple iOS devices, which would be iPads and iPhones, that there is no antivirus because the architecture of the system sandboxes all the apps, as long as that phone is not jailbroken, hacked, so that it doesn't follow the normal Apple rules. And so you typically don't use antivirus. What I typically recommend for Apple phones is, especially if they're going to control sensitive data, is mobile device management, because then we can enforce certain rules, policies, security configurations, encryption, etc. And I'd recommend that for any phone or any mobile device that has access to this sensitive data. Android devices are a different story. Android devices are a little bit more akin to, say, a Windows PC, where you can get antivirus tools, and there are a lot of good ones. A lot of free ones that are pretty decent. AVG offers a free one. I believe Avast offers a free one. I think ESET, WebRoots, there are a ton of products. But again, I would recommend mobile device management, because if we use mobile device management, We can create governance over a company's mobile devices or an organization's mobile devices while still protecting the individualism of the employee. You know, I know a lot of people use their personal devices, bring your own device into the office. These MDM tools, they sound intimidating. We're going to load something on your device, but it's more about enforcing security controls and saying, for example, that you can't have a phone without a password, or that we are going to encrypt the drive, or that we have the right to wipe your company email from it, which I do not think is an unreasonable thing. I really encourage people, if you have a mobile workforce, they're using iPhones, they're using Android devices, tablets, etc., rather than focus on just antivirus, make sure that your team is on mobile device management so that they can have a series of tools and security things that you can feel reasonably comfortable when people touch this stuff on mobile.
Great answer. All right, we did one more question. Is my organization required to use the NIST framework?
No, most likely. So if you want to think about it this way, NIST is like a great best practices guide. And NIST, with one great example is the standard NIST 800-171, a very common standard that you see a lot. It has all of these ideas and rules about how you protect data and policies, and they touch a bunch of different things. Not a billion, a bunch of different things. And it's a good framework. It's a model, right? It doesn't apply exactly to everybody. Certain compliance standards will say you have to meet the NIST framework, like you have to meet this NIST requirement. That's our framework. CMMC, which I was just referring to, is an auditing standard. So what they'll do is they'll say, okay, based on your CMMC level, you're level 3, which means you have to do this NIST stuff. And in that case, those organizations do have to do them. For other organizations, I say NIST is good to work with because it at least gives you a framework. And if you do a lot of the things that the NIST framework says, and then later somebody comes along and says, hey, we're PCI, or hey, we're HIPAA, or you know, state of Maryland creates a privacy law for data, and these are the controls you have to do, you now have a framework in place that maybe it doesn't 100% match up to what they're looking for, but it is a very, very good start, and it is going to be in line with good standards and practices today. So I really respect it, and I keep going back to it just because when we adopt those policies and procedures, we are basically making ourselves audit ready, if that makes sense. So we're putting ourselves in a position that if an auditor comes in and they say, well, what are you doing about cybersecurity? We can say, hey, we're doing this NIST stuff. These are all the things we're doing. And the auditor may say, hey, I want you to do this better, or I want you to do that better, or I want you to change this. But we're really operating more around the margins than we are, you know, starting from scratch. So I like it a lot. It's not required, to be clear. It's not like NIST is, there's the NIST law and everybody has to do NIST. It's not like that.
All right, excellent. And then we had one more question come in. Would the NIST framework have prevented recently highly publicized attacks such as the Baltimore ransomware attack?
Good question. Would it have? I mean, look, it's hard to predict the future. What I'll say about, for example, the city of Baltimore was it sounds like, and some of this information isn't, they're not exactly being 100% transparent about everything that happened, but it sounds like a lot of this was due to inadequate resources, both to have supportable systems and the resources to support those systems in place. And so I would argue that they weren't following the NIST framework, because if they were following the framework, that they would have good maintenance in place that addresses these concerns. They have good technology in place that is supportable, maintainable. You could put security tools on, et cetera. And the likelihood of an impactful ransomware attack on the city of Baltimore would have been much less. Can I sit here and say that by adopting this framework that attack would not have happened? No, I cannot. Because the reality is that even if we do all the great things that I'm talking about, all we're doing is lowering risk. If we want to think of the risk limbo bar, we're making the limbo bar lower and lower and lower, but the bar never really touches the floor. Somebody can squeeze by it. And what we're trying to do is manage risk better. I think we have to understand that, which is that this idea that we can just skip it or go by it, it's not really a matter of whether we're attacked. It's more like when and how do we respond to it. I think that's the reality we have to deal with today. And I definitely don't think the city of Baltimore was adequately prepared to deal with that attack. And I think that doing a NIST audit would have perhaps helped them. It wouldn't have guaranteed anything, but it would have put them in a much better position.
Okay, wonderful. Last question, unless any more come in, but does the NIST framework apply to small businesses?
It can apply to any business. How it applies will vary. It's obviously not expected that, let's say you have a business with 5 employees, you probably don't have a security engineer on staff. But I would imagine if you're a Fortune 500 company with thousands of employees, you have many security engineers on staff, people who spend a lot of money. I'm watching on HBO, the McMillions documentary, and they have, McDonald's, this huge corporation, have directors of security and stuff like that. And of course, what's funny is most people, when they think of McDonald's, they think of hamburgers and money and stuff like that. They don't think about security, but McDonald's is big enough to afford that. And so both organizations, McDonald's and a small business, can both apply these ideas, these concepts, these 5 general areas, which is why we like to talk about them. But they're not going to apply in the same way. You're not going to do things the same way. It's a way, I'd like to think of it as a way of thinking, a philosophy to adopt, rather than a prescription of things to do.
Okay, great answer. And with that, that wraps up all the questions that have come in.
Wonderful. Well, thanks everybody. Appreciate having you all here today. We are going to have a landing page out soon for the next webinar. We really would love to have you. Make sure you're subscribed to Security Tips, that you have, you get the weekly emails. Spoilers, we're going to have some vlogging soon where I'm going to do little tips on video. More to come on that. And we really love engaging with this stuff with you. So we hope to see you again real soon. Thank you so much.